Hello and welcome to the GitHub Copilot course. In this course, we're going to be creating a very basic project called Bucks to Bar, which has a bunch of inputs to allow users to input income and expenses for every month of the year, and then plot those values to a chart using chart.js, where the user can then download that chart as an image and open it up on their local machine. So this may look like a very basic project, but I wanted to create something that will allow us to learn how to use GitHub Copilot properly. So we're going to be writing very little code in this course because we're going to be prompting GitHub Copilot to write the code for us. Now, of course, it's not going to be able to write every single line of code for us, and we are going to have to give it some help along the way. So it's still very much the case of when I'm using GitHub Copilot, I look at it as more of a very advanced autocomplete, and I'm still using documentation for various libraries, and I'm still using Google, and I'm using ChatGPT. So all of these tools combined give us developers a really comprehensive toolbox that we can use to turbocharge our productivity. So with that said, in this course, we're going to be using Bootstrap, and we don't need to know anything about Bootstrap other than it contains a bunch of components that we can use. For example, this button is a Bootstrap button. These tabs are Bootstrap tabs, as well as some styling for inputs and input labels and things like that. So we don't need to know anything about Bootstrap because hopefully GitHub Copilot will create everything for us from Bootstrap whenever we provide GitHub Copilot with the appropriate prompts. And then for our chart, we're going to be using chart.js. And again, we're going to manually write very little code for this because we're going to rely on GitHub Copilot to generate the chart snippet for us. So with that said, in the next lecture, I look forward to diving into GitHub Copilot with you, and we'll make a start on creating our project. Hey guys, before we move on to the next video, I want to quickly point out that throughout this course, you'll probably see a review prompt similar to what you're seeing now, where Udemy will ask you to leave a rating and or review of the course so far. Now, this is optional. However, I'd really appreciate it if you did leave a rating and or a review when these prompts do show up, because it lets other students know whether this course is for them or not. Additionally, it would mean the world to me if you could leave a rating and or review. So thank you in advance if you do leave a rating and a review of the course, and I will see you in the next video where we'll continue with the course. In this lecture, we're going to get all set up and up and running on our local machine. Now, before we do that, there's a couple of things we're going to need to set up on our local machine to make development so much easier. Now, the first thing we need to install is Visual Studio Code, otherwise known as VSCode. Now, to install VSCode, we can download it from code.visualstudio.com, and it's available for Mac, Linux, and Windows. Obviously, I'm on Mac, so I'm seeing the download link here for Mac. So go ahead and download VSCode from the VSCode website and go through the installation process. I'm not going to do it here because I already have VSCode installed on my local machine. Now, if you're unfamiliar or you don't know what VSCode is, it's something called an IDE, or an integrated development environment. And all that means is it's just a piece of software, or it's an app that makes managing development projects so much easier. So we can use VSCode to write code, to manage files, and to manage our coding projects. Additionally, it's within VSCode that we can install extensions to VSCode. Specifically, we're going to be installing extensions around GitHub Copilot. So that's why we need VSCode to be able to run GitHub Copilot. So GitHub Copilot will actually be running within VSCode. With that said, once you've downloaded and installed VSCode, we need to open up VSCode. Now, once you're in VSCode, you need to select the Extensions tab on the left-hand side here. And there's 3 extensions specifically that we're going to need to install to code along in this course. The first one is GitHub Copilot. So we can do a search for extensions in the extensions marketplace for GitHub Copilot. We can see here we have GitHub Copilot coming up in the search results. I've already got it installed within VS Code. However, you'll need to install the GitHub Copilot extension. Additionally, you need to install the GitHub Copilot chat extension. Again, this is something I've already got installed in VS Code. However, you will also need to install this. Now, the GitHub Copilot extension is essentially a very advanced autocomplete. So we'll see an example of this when we start building out some of the files and start building out some of the functionality for our small project that we're going to build in this course. So we'll see GitHub Copilot in action once we get to actually editing some files. However, the GitHub Copilot chat extension really is a game changer when it comes to everything to do with coding and development. For example, we can use GitHub Copilot chat to explain snippets of code. We could also use GitHub Copilot chat to create files for us, or create multiple files for us for a particular project that we want to create. Now, of course, those aren't the only features. There's a bunch more features with GitHub Copilot chat, and this course will actually be heavily using GitHub Copilot chat. And one amazing feature about GitHub Copilot chat, and this was only just released, and that is GitHub Copilot chat now has context of your workspace and of all the files in your project. So it's aware of the files and the code that we write within a particular project. So this is such a really cool feature, because previously GitHub Copilot wasn't aware or didn't have any context of our projects. So it was kind of limited in that sense. If we needed to generate some code using GitHub Copilot, it was kind of limited because it didn't know and it didn't have much context or wasn't really aware of the whole entirety of our project. However, now with the new updates with GitHub Copilot chat, GitHub Copilot chat is aware of our project and does have context of our project. So it can give us better code suggestions and generate better code for us based on the context of our project. And at this point, you're going to need to either create a GitHub account or log into your existing GitHub account. Now, I'm already logged in to GitHub within VS Code here, and I've already got a GitHub Copilot subscription. However, you're going to need to sign up for a new subscription to GitHub Copilot if you don't already have one. Now, they are offering a free trial, which can be cancelled at any point during that free trial to avoid getting charged when the trial ends. But I'm not going to let you watch me fill out a bunch of forms just to sign up to GitHub Copilot. However, you should see a dialog on the bottom right-hand side to sign in or create an account with GitHub, so you can start using GitHub Copilot. Additionally, you can just head on over to the GitHub Copilot website. Now, at the time of this recording, you can access the subscription plans for GitHub Copilot from github.com/features/copilot. And you can see down here that they are indeed offering a free trial. However, after that free trial, it's $10 a month or $100 per year. So once you have an active GitHub Copilot subscription, whether it's a free trial or it's a paid subscription, you need to make sure that you link your VS Code to your GitHub account. To do that, the easiest way is to select this little profile icon on the left-hand side of VS Code, and then select Sign in with GitHub to use GitHub Copilot. So once you've signed into GitHub, you should be able to then use GitHub Copilot within VS Code. And to confirm that GitHub Copilot is working correctly, you should see a little GitHub Copilot icon on the bottom right of VS Code down here. All we need to do is click on that icon, and we can see here we have status is ready, which means GitHub Copilot is ready to be used within VS Code. Now, with that said, there is another extension we need to install, and that is the default browser extension. And this is just going to make opening up our HTML file within our default browser a lot easier. So it's this extension here, the Open in Default Browser extension. It's a very basic extension. However, it just makes opening up HTML files in the browser so much easier. So now that we've got our development environment all set up and running, in the next lecture, we're actually going to create our project. In this lecture, we're actually going to create our bare bones bucks2bar HTML project. So to do this, previously we'd have to build out the files ourselves. However, with GitHub Copilot Chat, we can ask it to build out the boilerplate for us. Now, if we open up the GitHub Copilot Chat icon on the left-hand side here, what we can do is, it says down in the prompt bar here, ask Copilot or type / for commands. Now, we want to type / here to be presented with a bunch of different commands that we can run that will give a bit more context to GitHub Copilot Chat. So GitHub Copilot Chat knows a bit more about what we're actually trying to achieve. Now, the specific command we want to use is the /new command using the @workspace prefix. So if we select this, we can see we have this @workspace /new command. Now here we can see in the example prompt, it says scaffold code for a new workspace. Now this is way too vague for our case. We want to say something like create an HTML project called bucks2bar with the latest version of Bootstrap. So let's hit enter on this and see what GitHub Copilot Chat comes back with. So we can see here we have a proposed directory structure coming back as part of the response. And this is the really cool thing here. And you may have quickly thought to yourself, what's the point in using GitHub Copilot Chat compared to ChatGPT? And it's this reason here. We have so many more options with GitHub Copilot Chat compared to ChatGPT. Of course, as well, GitHub Copilot Chat is trained on specifically code data. So this is the really cool thing here. We can actually create the workspace directly from GitHub Copilot Chat. So we don't need to create these boilerplate files ourselves. So let's hit create workspace and we'll be prompted to select the parent folder where we want to create our new project. I'm going to select my web projects folder here and select as parent folder. And we can see here that the GitHub Copilot Chat is actually creating all these files now as part of our brand new project. And there we go. We haven't done anything so far. We haven't written any code. We haven't created any files manually. GitHub Copilot Chat has set all of this up for us. Now, if we open up these files, we can see we have an index.html file. It's a very, very basic bare bones HTML file, and that's absolutely fine. We can see we have a bucks2bar title and welcome to bucks2bar. So it's taken the context we've given it and created the correct directory structure and the correct files. However, we can see we're referencing some links and scripts here which don't actually exist in our project. So where we previously said to GitHub Copilot Chat that we want to also integrate Bootstrap, this was probably not a good idea because it hasn't created these files and it's referencing files that don't actually exist. With that said, let's remove the Bootstrap CSS. Let's remove the Bootstrap JS down here. Now again, you might not have these as part of your file structure. However, if there's any reference to Bootstrap in the HTML file, it's best just to remove that because we're going to go over to the Bootstrap documentation to implement Bootstrap ourselves. Now, the reason I added to integrate Bootstrap into the initial prompt in GitHub Copilot Chat was just to show you what will come back. With that said, again, I'm just going to remove all these comments here and save our index.html file. Let's check out our JS directory. We can see we have a blank JavaScript file, and as well as our CSS directory, we have a blank CSS file. Now, if we right click on index.html, we can see here open in default browser. Now, this is the extension that we installed that's giving us the option here to open up this HTML file in our default browser. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Let's see what we've got so far. So it's open in default browser, and there we go. We can see we have a very, very basic HTML file. From here, let's actually integrate Bootstrap into our project. So let's take a look at this in the next lecture. Continuing from the last lecture then, let's implement the latest version of Bootstrap within our project. To do that, we need to head on over to the Bootstrap documentation at getbootstrap.com. Then we want to click on Read the Docs here, and specifically on the right-hand side here, we should see CDN links. So let's click on CDN links, and we can see to integrate Bootstrap properly, there's 2 links we need to add to our project. Now, all throughout this course, I'm going to try and be in the mindset of a very, very beginner or amateur developer. So I'm going to assume that these links here, just because they're linking to a CSS and JS file, I'm going to assume you don't know how to integrate these into an HTML project. So we're going to use GitHub Copilot chat for this. First of all, let's copy the CSS file and head on back to VSCode. Let's open up GitHub Copilot chat, and let's make the window a little bit big here. And we're going to remove the @workspace new, but we're going to say @workspace here and say something like add, and then paste in the CSS link, and then let's head on back to the browser and copy the JavaScript link and head on back to VS Code, and let's paste in the JavaScript link here. So add the CSS link and the JS link to the project. Now, this is a very vague prompt on purpose. I could have easily said, because I know to add the CSS file as part of a link tag and the JS file as part of a script tag. However, I'm keeping it vague on purpose because I really want to try and emphasize just how useful this tool is, even for beginner developers. Additionally, we can see here we also have an example prompt or a suggested prompt, because after we've created our Bugs2Bar project, because we specified Bootstrap in the initial prompt, GitHub Copilot is suggesting to run this prompt next. How can I link the Bootstrap CSS and JavaScript files to my HTML project? However, we're going to ignore this suggestion and add in this prompt here. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. So we can see GitHub Copilot has returned a suggestion to us. And because we added the @workspace command, GitHub Copilot is going to give us a more specific answer based on our workspace or based on our project and all the files within our project. So we can see here, the suggestion is to add Bootstrap to your project, you need to include the Bootstrap CSS and JS CDN links in your index.html file. And it's got a link here, so we can click on this link here. Obviously, I've already got index.html open. However, if we close index.html and click on index.html here in the suggestion, GitHub Copilot opens that file for us. Then we can see here, here's how you can do it. And it's giving us the suggestion here. We can see Bootstrap CSS, and it's referencing the URL that we gave it from the Bootstrap documentation. Additionally, we can see that GitHub Copilot has actually added the CSS, and if we scroll down here, the JS as well, also using the JS link from the Bootstrap documentation. It's added these 2 links in to these URLs. It's added them into our index.html file. So it hasn't created a brand new index.html file. It's actually integrated these 2 links into our already existing HTML file. So all we need to do is copy this suggestion here. We could do this by using the copy icon here, or just selecting all this code and copying it manually. And we can just paste it in to our index.html file like so. So now if we head on back to our file explorer, let's right click on index.html now and select open in default browser. There we go. We can see the font has changed to a much nicer font because now we've got the CSS from Bootstrap. With that said, we can start using now Bootstrap components. So if we head on over to the Bootstrap documentation and scroll down to the components section, ideally if we scroll down here to the navbar component, ideally this is exactly what we want to implement. We want to implement a navbar, and we can see here an example of a navbar. However, I don't want to rely too much on documentation. Again, I want to try and use GitHub Copilot chat as much as possible to build out our project. So actually, if we head on back to our project, and if we open up GitHub Copilot chat again, and if we add a new prompt in here and say something like, give me the code for a dark bootstrap nav bar. Let's hit enter on this, and we can see we receive a response back. And again, the really cool thing is it's used our bucks2bar title. So GitHub Copilot is aware of our project name called bucks2bar. So it's added that in to our navbar. Now, again, the really cool thing with this is with these code snippets, if we're only generating code snippets rather than entire files, or the entire content for a file, I should say, if we're only generating code snippets, we can integrate this code snippet here. If we select the area that we want to add this code snippet into in our index.html file, first of all, as part of the response, we can see here, GitHub Copilot is suggesting that we place this code within the body tag of our HTML file. So within the body tag then, let's make sure our cursor is just after the body tag. And for this code snippet here, we can select this icon here, insert at cursor. So let's select this option, and there we go. All that code was copied into the place where our cursor was. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser, let's give our index.html file a refresh, and there we go. We can see we have a nice dark colored navbar. Now, before we finish up this lecture, you may have noticed that in that last prompt that we created, I didn't use the @workspace command. So let's head on back to our VS Code, and within GitHub Copilot chat, when I generated the navbar here, I didn't prefix the prompt with @workspace. Now, the reason for this is because we already knew that we wanted to add this navbar within our index.html file. So all we wanted was to create a bootstrap navbar snippet. Now, essentially, this is just a generic navbar snippet. So we don't really need any context of our workspace. So only when we need some context of our workspace do we really need to use the @workspace command. Now, you may be thinking, well, how did then GitHub Copilot chat know about our bucks2bar project title if we didn't use the @workspace command? Well, that is because GitHub Copilot also has context of previous messages in our chat. So right at the top here, we said that we wanted to call our project bucks2bar. So this is where GitHub Copilot chat has got the context from when we generated our navbar. However, if we scroll up to the previous command or the previous prompt, we prefixed this prompt with the workspace command. So because we prefixed this prompt with the workspace command, GitHub Copilot chat is going to use the context of our workspace. So then it knows of all of the files in our project. That's why it was able to actually link to a specific file in our project. If we hadn't have used the @workspace command for this particular prompt, then GitHub Copilot chat wouldn't have been able to provide this link to our index.html file, and also it wouldn't have been able to read our index.html file. Because remember, as part of this prompt, GitHub Copilot chat actually read the existing contents of our index.html file and added in the relevant Bootstrap CSS and Bootstrap JS link and script tags. So that is a sort of general rule of thumb. We only need to use the @workspace command and prefix our prompts with @workspace anytime we need GitHub Copilot's chat to have knowledge of our workspace and all of the files and their contents in our workspace. However, we don't need to use the @workspace command if we're just generating some code snippets and we know exactly where those code snippets are going to go within our project. So it's a subtle difference and a subtle distinction, but that is the distinction. With that said, In the next lecture, we're going to continue building out our navbar, and we're going to take a look at using the GitHub Copilot Quick Chat and the GitHub Copilot Inline Chat. So we'll start taking a look at this in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at a slightly different way we can use GitHub Copilot Chat, and that is by using the inline chat. So we still have exactly the same functionality as GitHub Copilot Chat. However, we're going to be editing code inline. Now, if we quickly take a look at the completed project, ideally what we want to do is, in our project, we've got these redundant links here. So ideally what we'll do is we'll remove those links, we'll make our bucks2bar title a little bit bigger, and we'll add our tabs. So we'll have our data and our chart. Now, these tabs, again, these are going to be coming from Bootstrap. So if we refer to the Bootstrap documentation, if we scroll down on the left-hand side for components here, we should see navs and tabs. And if we scroll down to the tabs section, we can see it on the right-hand side here actually is tabs. So we can scroll down though to the tab section. And this is exactly what we want. We want tabs here where when we click on the tab, the content will change underneath, relevant to the tab that's selected. So first of all, let's remove the redundant links that we have in our current project using the inline chat from GitHub Copilot Chat. So let's head on back to our code in VSCode. Now let's select all of the navbar from the previous lecture that GitHub Copilot Chat generated for us. So let's select this entire nav tag here. Remember, this entire snippet was generated by GitHub Copilot Chat. However, now what we can do is, if we select this light bulb icon, we can select Modify using Copilot. So let's do exactly that. Let's select Modify using Copilot, and we can see an inline chat has appeared. Now, what we want to do is ideally make our bucks2bar font a little bit bigger, and we want to remove everything else other than the title, i.e. other than the bucks2bar title. Now, the best way to do this is not to combine these two tasks in a single prompt. Instead, it's way better to perform each prompt individually. So that's one little tip as well with prompts. The best way to get the best results out of prompts is ideally just give single tasks at a time and then iterate upon those tasks and iterate upon those results that come back. With that said, I think the first task we should tackle is increasing the bucks2bar font size. So let's do this then. Let's type in here, increase the font size for the bucks2bar title. So let's hit enter on this and let's see what comes back as part of the suggestion. And we can see the response streaming back in real time. So nothing has changed other than this single line of code here. And it may be a little bit difficult to see, but we can use this window size tool to increase the window size for this snippet of code here. We can see that this snippet here, it's highlighted in red, which means it's going to be replaced. And it's going to be replaced with the snippet on the right. So let's drag the window over so we can see the snippet on the right. This highlighted green snippet will be replacing the highlighted red snippet. So if we scroll across, we can see the update here. We're going to have a font size of 24 pixels. Obviously, we didn't give the prompt any font size to increase it to. So it's just selected 24 pixels, assuming this will be sufficient for us. So I'm going to go ahead and accept this change. Or if you weren't happy with this change, you could regenerate the change or regenerate the response. So we could hit regenerate here to try and get back something different. However, I'm going to accept this change and save index.html now, and then head on back to the browser and give our index.html file a refresh, and this is looking a lot nicer. From here, let's remove the redundant menu items. So again, let's head on back to our code, and I'm going to select this entire nav tag again and do exactly the same thing. Let's open up the inline chat using the modify using Copilot. Then let's say something like remove all of the nav bar contents other than the bucks to bar title. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. We can see the response streaming back again, and we can see all of this code is now going to be removed and replaced with, or not replaced with actually, but the only code that will remain is this anchor tag. So let's accept this change, and there we go. Let's save our index.html file now and head on back to the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. We no longer have the redundant menu items. From here, we're going to ask GitHub Copilot Chat to give us 2 tabs that we can toggle between. The first one will be data, and the second one will be chart. So again, let's head on back to our code. Now, instead of using the chat on the left-hand side here, I'm going to click on the chat icon again to close the chat window. So our code window is looking a little bit bigger now. And ideally, what we're going to do is underneath this nav and underneath welcome to Bucks to Bar. So underneath this H1 title here, I'm going to open up the GitHub Copilot Quick Chat. So this is different to the inline chat that we just saw. To do that, on Mac, we can use Command, Shift, and I. Or if you're on Windows, it's Control, Shift, and I. Now I'm going to do exactly the same here. I'm going to say generate 2 Bootstrap tabs. The first one will have the label data, and the second one will have the label chart. And then I'm going to say something like add placeholder text for each tab content. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back as part of the chat. So we can see the response streaming back, and we can see we have a data and a chart tab. We see we have tab panes, placeholder text for data tab, and placeholder text for chart tab. Then we can see underneath here, the really cool thing again is because we've opened up the quick chat on index.html, it says you can insert this code at line 25 where your cursor is. And this is absolutely perfect. Our cursor is already on line 25, and it's actually, the chat panel is actually in the way, but it's just after the H1 tag here. So I'm going to select here, instead of the copy icon, I'm going to select insert at cursor. So I'm going to select this, and we'll see that all that code was added in after the H1 tag. Now, to close the chat window, of course, we can use the close quick chat icon here, or we can simply use escape. So if we save index.html now and take a look in the browser, let's give index.html a refresh, and there we go. We see we have our 2 tabs now. We have data and chart, and anytime we click on each tab, we can see that the relevant tab data or tab content is displaying for the selected tab. Now, ideally, we'll have the same width constraint on our welcome to Bucks to Bar heading as the width constraint on our tabs. To do this, we're not going to use Copilot Chat. We're just going to head on back to the code and simply move this H1 into this div tag above our nav tabs. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give it a refresh, and there we go. This is looking a lot nicer. Now, from here, what we need to do is generate all of the inputs from January to December for income and expenses. Now, one thing to note as well is this view is responsive, which means it looks slightly different on smaller screen sizes. So if we reduce the screen size down, you'll notice that we have 2 months per row as part of our layout. But if we reduce the screen size, we can see we only have 1 month per row. So we'll take a look at trying to create this responsive layout using GitHub Copilot Chat in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at how we can create responsive layouts using GitHub Copilot Chat. Now, just like what I mentioned before, ideally what we're going to do is break down our prompt into multiple tasks. Ideally, we won't give GitHub Copilot Chat one massive task to do. What we're going to do is just break down our problem into smaller problems and feed each problem into GitHub Copilot chat. Now, the first thing we should start with, I think, is because this is going to be a responsive layout, we're going to tell GitHub Copilot chat that we want just one bootstrap row that contains 2 columns. On mobile screen sizes, we'll have 1 column per row, and on medium screen sizes and above, we'll have 2 columns per row. So each month represents a column. So we have January here and February here. So this will be 2 columns for a single row. Then if we bring the screen size down, we'll have 1 column on a single row. So these rows will stack. Then we can feed in additional problems and additional tasks. So we're not going to look at the income and expenses layout just yet. We just want to get the very basic 2-column layout sorted first. Now, if we head on over to the Bootstrap documentation and specifically to the layout and the grid section, we can see this is the type of layout we are trying to achieve using columns and rows. However, again, we don't need to be too familiar with the Bootstrap documentation because we're going to be using GitHub Copilot chat for this. With that said, let's head on back to our code. And before we open up GitHub Copilot chat and start giving it commands and prompts to add these rows in, ideally what we're going to do is, if we quickly take a look in the browser at our project, let's assume for a second that we've come back to our project after a long time of not opening our project, or we've been inherited this project. And we're not quite sure where this data and this chart tab is stored or is being rendered from within our project. Let's assume that our project is quite a large project. It's got multiple files, and we want to know exactly where this data and chart tab is being rendered within our project structure. Of course, we know exactly that we've only got one HTML file, so it's obviously going to be in that HTML file. However, just for a second, let's assume that we've got a huge project and we're not sure where these tabs are being rendered. So if we head on back to our code, let's open up GitHub Copilot chat and let's ask it using the workspace command, where are the data and chart tabs being rendered? So let's see what the response is coming back from Copilot chat. And we can see it's coming back with the correct answer. The data and chart tabs are being rendered in the index.html file. And it's giving us a bunch more context as well for those tabs. However, we just want to click on index.html to open up this file. And of course, we can see here, obviously, this is where our Bootstrap tabs are being rendered. Now, ideally, in our tab panes, we're going to remove this placeholder text for the data tab. So let's remove the placeholder text here. And instead now, we're going to give Copilot the instructions to create our responsive layout. So we're going to say something like, give me the HTML for a bootstrap row that contains 2 columns. On mobile screen sizes, there should be 1 column per row, and on medium screen sizes and above, there should be 2 columns per row. So let's hit enter on this and see what the response is from Copilot. We can see the response streaming back in. And the really cool thing is it's actually giving us an explanation of the classes that it uses and exactly what those classes do. So it's saying in this code, call MD6, which we can see here for each of our columns, means that on medium screens and larger, each column will take up 6 out of 12 columns in the grid. Now, if we're not quite sure what that means, we can ask it as well, what does it mean by 12 columns in the grid? So let's say, what do you mean by 12 columns per grid? Now, I already know the answer to this. It's just the column structure that Bootstrap uses. There's 12 columns per row. And actually my prompt here, I should say, what do you mean by 12 columns in the grid, not per grid? So 12 columns in the grid. So let's hit enter on this And Copilot is giving us the correct answer back. It's saying in Bootstrap, the grid system is used for creating page layouts throughout a series of rows and columns. And the structure is based on a 12-column structure, which means that a single row spans the width of the page and can be divided up into 12 columns. So with that said, we just want to use the actual snippet, the HTML snippet that it gave us. So again, I'm going to place my cursor within the Data tab content, and we're going to select Insert at Cursor. So let's select this now, and of course, we don't have any content for our columns yet. So let's actually add that content in. And to do this, we're going to use the inline chat. So let's select each of our columns here, and let's select the light bulb and modify using Copilot. And I'm going to ask it to add January and February as labels to each column. So let's hit enter on this, and we can see the response streaming back. We can see it's adding January and February. Let's accept these changes. So let's save our index.html file and take a look in the browser just to see what we've got so far. Let's give our index.html file a refresh, and we can see we have 2 columns on a row. Let's bring the screen size down. So we need to select this icon within the developer tools in Google Chrome. And if we bring the screen size down, we can see that on small screen sizes, our columns collapse. So this is exactly the structure that we want for our grid. From here, we just need to add our inputs. So we need to add our income and expenses inputs. And we need to add these into each column. So if we head on back to our code, let's select our row again, and we're going to use the inline chat again. So let's select modify using Copilot. And we're going to ask Copilot something like, for each column, add a bootstrap row with 2 columns. The first column will have an input income, and the second column will have an input expenses. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. And again, we can see the response streaming back in real time. We can see underneath January, we're going to have a new row. We'll have 2 columns, and we'll have income and expenses as inputs. And we can see appropriate IDs set for our inputs. We can see Jan income and Jan expenses. And if we scroll down to February, we can see exactly the same thing. So if we scroll up then and accept this change, let's save index.html and head on back to the browser. Let's give it a refresh. And there we go. We can see income and expenses for January and February. Now, if you'd prefer, we could use the same layout as the completed project, where we have this sort of prefix for the input rather than a label above the input. To do this, we can head on over to the Bootstrap documentation, and let's scroll down to Forms and Input Group. And if we scroll down here, we can see the basic example where an input group actually is a prefix or a suffix for a particular HTML input. So if we wanted to add this type of layout, we could head on back to our code and again use GitHub Copilot chat. We're going to use the inline chat again. So let's select modify using Copilot. And we could say something like change the income and expenses labels into Bootstrap input groups. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. Now we can see the response streaming back again in real time. Now let's see what's going to change. We can see here our label is highlighted in red, so that's going to be removed, but it's going to be replaced with an input group. And we can see we have an input group text of income and exactly the same thing for expenses. So let's see what happens if we accept this change. Let's save index.html again and head on back to the browser. Let's hit refresh on our project. And there we go. We have income and expenses now rendering as an input group rather than a label above the input HTML tag. Now from here, all we need to do is fill out the rest of our months. To do this, let's head on back to our code and let's select our entire row here. So our row that contains our January and February columns, let's select this entire row. Then let's head into GitHub Copilot chat, and we're going to say, based on the selected HTML, do exactly the same, but for months March to December. Because remember, we already have January and February, so we need March to December. So let's hit enter on this, and we can see the response streaming back. Now, unfortunately, it's only done March and April, so we could do 2 months at a time. That's absolutely fine. So underneath February then, let's add our cursor in here, and let's select Insert at Cursor to add March and April. Let's remove this comment here, and we're just going to ask it, do the same for May and June, July and August, September and October, November and December. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. And it looks like all it wants to do is give us 2 months at a time. This is probably due to the limitations of the response, so it can't respond back with a crazy amount of text. However, we're just going to do exactly the same thing here. Underneath our April month, we're just going to select Insert at Cursor. We're going to do exactly the same May, June. Let's remove this comment. Let's say do exactly the same for July and August. And again, let's select Insert at Cursor. We're going to do exactly the same. Let's say do the same for September and October. Then again, let's Insert at Cursor. And finally, the last 2 months, let's say do the same for November and December. So again, same thing here. Let's select Insert at Cursor. Let's save our index.html file now and head on back to the browser. Let's give our index.html a refresh. And there we go. We can see we're rendering January to December, and we have income and expenses for each month. Now from here, all we need to do is implement our charts functionality. So anytime we select the chart tab, ideally, any values that are input to income and expenses for a given month, this will plot a bar chart using charts.js. So we'll take a look at how we can implement this in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to add a download button to our charts tab, and we're going to download the chart to our local machine as an image. So if we head on back to VSCode, we're going to do something slightly different in this lecture. Within index.html, underneath our div here that's wrapping the canvas for our chart, we're going to take a look at comment-driven prompts rather than using GitHub Copilot chat. Now what we'll see is, a lot of the time when we're writing markup, HTML markup or code, if we have GitHub Copilot enabled, we should see at the bottom here the GitHub Copilot icon, and it will actually start giving us back suggestions based on the file that we're coding up. So we'll see that a little loading spinner will appear anytime GitHub Copilot is working in the background to try and generate some suggestions for us. So one way to do this is by using comments. So if we open up an HTML comment here, I'm going to say something like bootstrap button with the label download. Now you'll notice here, I'm not saying anything like give me a bootstrap button with the label download or generate me a button with the label download. All we're doing here is describing what we expect the code to be doing, or in this case, the HTML markup to be doing. So we're going to have a bootstrap button with the label download. So this is a slightly different way to generate code. We're not actually giving a prompt here. We're just giving a comment which will describe the code underneath. So if we hit enter on this, we should see the loading spinner for GitHub Copilot, and it's brought back a suggestion. Now, if we wanted to accept this suggestion, we could easily hit accept here or hit tab on our keyboard, or we can see there are 2 suggestions, so we could toggle through the different suggestions. Now, I'm not particularly happy with either of those suggestions, so I'm going to say something like a plain Bootstrap button with the label download. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. And I think this looks a lot nicer. And this is a lot less code, and this is exactly what I want. And we can also see 3 suggestions now. So we can see that these are a lot more basic. There's a lot less markup coming back as part of these responses. So I'm actually going to select this first suggestion here. So I'm going to hit tab on my keyboard. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser, let's give our index.html file a refresh and click on the chart tab, and we can see our new download button. All we need to do from here is hook up some JavaScript to hook into the click event for our download button and download the canvas as an image. So back in our code, the first thing we're going to do is ask GitHub Copilot how we can achieve this. So we're going to say something like, how can I download a canvas HTML element as an image? So let's see what the suggestion is coming back. I actually already know how to do this, but again, I just want to emphasize how useful Copilot is in producing results where we might not be 100% sure on how to achieve the desired effect. So we can see here, GitHub Copilot has suggested this particular snippet here, and we're going to use the toData URL. So let's see what happens then in our script.js. It's also saying first add an event lister for the click event on the download button in your script.js file. So within script.js, if we scroll to the top here, within the window on load, let's just copy this entire code snippet using the insert add cursor. Let's save this now then and see what happens. So if we head on back to our browser, let's give index.html a refresh and let's just add some dummy values in for January. Let's click on charts. Let's see what happens when we click download. And there we go. We can see a PNG was downloaded called chart.png. Let's click on this and open it up. And there we go. We can see we have a PNG for our chart.js bar chart. In this lecture, we're going to see how we can integrate a chart.js bar chart using GitHub Copilot Chat. Now, let's open up our chat window here and ask GitHub Copilot, how do I integrate a chart.js bar chart for the chart tab? And actually, I'm going to say for the chart tab content. Now, just to reiterate, all of our prompts really need to be, if we want to get the most out of GitHub Copilot Chat, all of our prompts really need to be as specific as possible. So we're saying we want to integrate a chart.js bar chart. So we're specifying the library, which is chart.js, and the type of chart we want to integrate, which is bar chart. And we're saying where we want to integrate this chart. So it's the chart tab content. With that said, let's hit enter on this and see what GitHub Copilot Chat comes back with. Now, one thing I forgot to do for this prompt was, ideally we'll need to prefix this prompt with the @workspace command. So we can see here, GitHub Copilot has done its best to give us the installation steps for chart.js and get it up and running in our project. However, it's not really specific to our project. It's just provided a bunch of snippets or a snippet of code with a bunch of different elements, which isn't really specific to our project. Ideally, we want GitHub Copilot Chat to tell us exactly where all these pieces should go. So let's prefix our prompt with the @workspace command. And I'm just going to copy, if we scroll up here, I'm going to copy our previous command and paste it in. But now we have it prefixed with the @workspace command. So let's hit enter on this and see the difference now in GitHub Copilot's response. So our response has streamed back from GitHub Copilot Chat. And if we scroll all the way to the top of the response, we can see that this response is actually so much better because we used the @workspace command. So GitHub Copilot is now telling us exactly how to integrate chart.js within our project. So it's giving us the steps here. However, it's also giving us an example. So it's saying, in your index.html file, add the following. So let's add these two tags in here, the chart.js library. I'm going to include this right to the top in our head tag. So if we scroll up in the top of index.html, all the way to the top, within the head tag, I'm going to paste this script in here, and our canvas element, so this div tag here, I'm going to add, if we scroll all the way down to our tab panes, all the way underneath all of our months. Let's scroll all the way down. We should be able to then find the chart tab placeholder. So let's remove the chart tab placeholder and add in this code snippet for our chart.js bar chart. Now, GitHub Copilot is also saying in your js/scripts.js file, add the following. So we can click on js/script.js to open up this file. Let's remove this comment here, but let's use the insert at cursor to paste in this code snippet that came back from GitHub Copilot. Additionally, GitHub Copilot is also saying in the data property of the datasets array, you'll need to replace income data here and expenses data here with the actual data for your income and expenses. This data should be an array of numbers where each number corresponds to a month in the labels array. So pretty straightforward. We can see we just have a comment here for data where we need to insert this data ourselves. However, before we do that, let's hit save on our script.js. Let's make sure we save index.html. And let's take a look in the browser at index.html. Let's give it a refresh. Let's select charts now. And there we go. We can see we have a chart with January all the way to December for our months. And we have income and expenses, but of course we have no data at the moment for income and expenses for each month. However, we're pretty much there. All we need to do is add this data in exactly where GitHub Copilot told us to add it into. So if we head on back to our code then, ideally what we want to do is grab all of the input values within index.html, grab all of the input values for income and expenses for each month, and we want to use them in our script.js for our data for income and expenses. So first of all, let's break down this problem. Ideally, first of all, we need to grab the values, the income and expenses values for each month. So let's ask GitHub Copilot chat then. Let's say at workspace again, because ideally we want GitHub Copilot to tell us where to add this functionality or where we can actually implement grabbing the values for income and expenses. And we're going to say, based on all of the input IDs in index.html, give me the appropriate code to retrieve the values for income and expenses for each month. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. So as part of our response, we can see that every single income and expenses are being stored in a variable. So GitHub Copilot has suggested to grab each of these values using document.getElementById, followed by the actual ID for each of those inputs. So these were all the IDs that GitHub Copilot chat actually gave us for the code snippets for all of our inputs that we added in index.html. So it's referencing the correct IDs for income and expenses for each month, and it's suggesting the code should be placed in your script.js file. So let's go ahead and do that then. Within our script.js above my chart here, we want to just use the insert at cursor. So let's hit insert at cursor to grab all the values for income and expenses for each month. However, there's still one thing we need to do, and that is we need to map all of these variables to our, if we scroll down to our chart, to our data array. So let's ask Copilot Chat how we can do this. And actually, Copilot Chat has given me a suggestion here. How can I dynamically update the bar chart with the retrieved income and expenses values for each month? So this isn't 100% exactly what I wanted to ask, but I'm just going to run this suggestion and see what the response is coming back. So I'm going to click on this suggestion. And unfortunately, Copilot Chat is not being super helpful with this, even though this was its suggested prompt. However, let's see if we can actually get an answer back with this prompt. We can use the arrow keys on our keyboard to select any of the previous prompts. So if we hit the up arrow on our keyboard, we can select the previously run prompt. So I'm going to prefix this, though, with workspace. So let's see if we can generate a response now. So let's hit enter on this. And again, GitHub Copilot, even though this was the suggested prompt to use from GitHub Copilot, it's not being super helpful. However, what I wanted to ask was, again, we're going to use the @workspace command. What I was going to ask was, give me the appropriate code to set the income and expenses data arrays in, and let's reference the correct value here. So in the my chart variable. So we're just going to say in my chart like this. Remember, we need to be super specific when we're prompting GitHub Copilot Chat to get the best result possible back from GitHub Copilot Chat. So we're going to say, give me the appropriate code to set the income and expenses data arrays in my chart based on the income and expenses variables for each month. Like so. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back as part of the response. So we can see the response coming back. GitHub Copilot is suggesting we create an income and expenses array. And it's saying again that this code should be placed in your script.js file. Now, instead of using all of this code snippet here, we're going to just use the income and expenses arrays. So underneath all of our income and expenses variables, let's add in the income data and the expenses data, and we can just reference the income data array and the expenses data for the empty data arrays here. So let's, for data, just reference income data for the income data set. And for expenses, we want to reference the expenses data. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser, let's give our index.html file a refresh, and let's try and add some data in for our months. So I'm going to say 5,000 income and 2,000 expenses for January. Let's click on my chart here, and we can see nothing is actually happening. And that is because if we head on back to VSCode, so anytime we add some new data in to our inputs, ideally we need to refresh our chart. So ideally this will happen whenever we actually click on the chart tab. So anytime we click on the chart tab, we're going to grab all of the data from our months and just redraw the chart. So we're going to ask GitHub Copilot Chat to do this. We're going to say, @workspace again, only run the code in script.js anytime the chart tab is clicked. So let's hit enter on this and see what comes back. And GitHub Copilot is suggesting we first need to add an ID to our chart tab called chart-tab. And it's saying in index.html, because obviously that's where our charts are being rendered from. So in index.html then, if we scroll all the way to our chart tab, so it's right at the top here, all the way at the top here for our tabs. If we open up the code window a little bit bigger here, it's saying for our chart tab, we want to add, or we need to add an ID to this chart tab. So let's add an ID here of chart-tab. Then it's saying in your script.js file, add an event listener for the click event on the chart tab, and then add our existing code within this event listener. So let's do that then. Let's copy this and paste it in for our script.js file. So right to the top of our script.js, let's paste it in here. However, we just want to move the closing curly brace and bracket and semicolon right at the bottom of our file. So then all of our existing code is now within this click event listener. So let's save this and take a look in the browser and see what we've got. Let's give index.html a refresh. Then let's add some income and expenses. Let's click on chart now. And there we go. We can see our bar chart is being populated as expected. However, what happens if we go back to data and we try and add some income and expenses for another month, then click on chart, we can see that those new values aren't being updated in our chart. Now, to fix this is really easy. All we need to do is head on back to our code and change things around a little bit and actually refer to the response from one of our previous prompts. Now, the first thing we need to do is open up our JS and script.js file. And what we want to do is, first of all, add our entire code here into a window.onload event. So let's add window.onload here and set this equal to a function. Now, what's going to happen is all of this code here, let's select all of this code and cut it and paste it into the window.onload function. Now, all this is going to do is make sure that our HTML has all loaded before we actually execute any JavaScript. Then we just need to change a few things around based on the response from one of our previous prompts. So if we scroll up to the previous prompt we had, which created the arrays for income and expenses, we actually want to copy this last section here, where we're updating the data sets and setting it equal to income and expenses. Then we're running mychart.update to update the values in the chart. So to do this, all we need to do is first of all move the context, which is grabbing the canvas element for our chart. We need to move this outside of the click event handler for our chart tab, which means we're only ever grabbing this my chart element once when the document is loaded, and we're never trying to re-grab that element anytime we click our charts tab. Then we need to scroll down to our, if we scroll down here to our new chart object, we need to move this as well. Let's move this entire object, and we need to move it up to the top just underneath where we're grabbing our context. So again, we're only ever creating one new chart object whenever our window loads. We're not going to create this new chart object anytime we click our charts tab. However, every time we click our chart tab, we want to grab all of the new values for income and expenses. Then we just need, underneath our income and expenses data arrays, we just need to paste in these 3 lines of code here. So underneath here, we're going to set the data sets for my chart equal to income data and expenses data, and we're going to update our chart. And actually, this needs to be moved into the closing curly brace and closing bracket of the onClick handler. So underneath where we have our income and expenses data arrays, right underneath there, this is where we want to add those 3 lines of code. Now, there's one last thing we need to do, and that is if we scroll to the top of our file here, where we are initially setting our data sets to income data and expenses data, we just want to set these to an empty array. So whenever the page loads, we're not going to create the chart with any data in it. We're just going to create an empty chart. However, when the user clicks on the chart tab, that's when we'll enter this function here and grab all of the values for income and expenses and update our chart down here. So now if we save our script.js file and head on back to the browser, let's give index.html a refresh. And now let's add some data in for January. I'm just going to add some example data in here. Let's click on chart. We can see the values plot successfully for January. Now let's see what happens when we try and add something in for February. Let's add some dummy values in here. Let's click on chart now. And there we go. We can see our chart is now updating. So the last thing we need to do now is hook up our download button. First of all, we need to create a download button and hook up the functionality where we can actually download this entire chart as an image to our local machine. Now we'll be doing this slightly differently in the next lecture, and we'll be doing this via comment-driven prompts. So this is where we're going to take a look at the autocomplete side of things with GitHub Copilot. So we'll take a look at that in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at how GitHub Copilot can actually assist us anytime we have any errors in our terminal. So for example, I've got a completely different project here now. So this isn't anything to do with the project we've been creating in this course. I've got a completely different project. And the reason for that is because I want to try and trigger some errors in the terminal while trying to run this project. Now, you don't need to know anything about this project. That's not the point of this lecture. The point of this lecture is I'm going to try and create some errors in the terminal while running this project, and then get GitHub Copilot to assist me in solving those issues. So I'm going to try and run this project now from the terminal using npm start. Now, if you're a web developer, you're probably already familiar with npm. However, if you're not familiar with npm, don't worry, because I'm just trying to create some errors in the terminal and get Copilot to fix those errors. So I'm going to run npm start here, and we can see we're getting an error in the terminal. Now, the error in the terminal is pretty self-explanatory. However, what we can do is select the entire error here. We can right-click and select Copilot, explain this. So Copilot is hopefully going to then give us an explanation for this error, and we can see it's using the @terminal command. And it's giving us an explanation. And this is indeed correct. So the project I'm trying to run requires a later version of Node.js than I'm actually running. And it's giving an explanation, and it's actually saying that we need to install using NVM, or Node Version Manager. We need to install a later version of Node.js. Additionally, there'll be some errors in the terminal where we'll be able to see this little magic icon here. And this is the Copilot icon. So we can click on this and select explain using Copilot. And exactly the same thing will happen. GitHub Copilot will create a @terminal command, and it will explain the error that we're seeing in the terminal. Additionally, it will provide some potential solutions. And another really cool thing with GitHub Copilot when trying to explain terminal errors is sometimes GitHub Copilot will provide additional commands that we can actually run in the terminal. So for example, here it's providing us a command that we can run in the terminal to see if this particular file exists. So obviously the reason this error was happening was because I was trying to run a file in the terminal which didn't exist. So then if we want to run some commands that Copilot is suggesting, we can select this icon here, insert into terminal, and it will insert that command into the terminal. And we can then hit enter on this and run that command. So these are just some of the strategies we can use when using Copilot to try and help us with any issues or any errors that we may be experiencing within the terminal. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at how we can use GitHub Copilot to assist us anytime we need to commit any changes of our project to a GitHub repository. Now, if you're not sure what a GitHub repository is, essentially all it is it's a platform where we can host our projects and our code. And then anytime we want to make changes to that code, GitHub will track those changes. So we can easily see what files were changed and when they were changed. Now, again, if you're already a web developer, you're going to be very familiar with GitHub. Now, I'm going to give you a quick demonstration here of how GitHub Copilot can assist us in our commit messages anytime we make a change to a GitHub repository. Now, I've already gone ahead of time and uploaded my code to a GitHub repository. And let's say we want to make a change to this code now. So I'm just going to update this H1 here. I'm going to say, welcome to Bucks to Bar. And then I'm just going to add an H2 underneath and say something like the best platform to track your income and expenses. So let's save index.html then. And we can see now our file was tracked in the source control tab. We can see that there was a change made to index.html. What we can do now is select this little magic icon here. So this is the GitHub Copilot icon, and we can generate a commit message with Copilot. So let's click on this icon and see what Copilot comes back with. And there we go. We can see it saying add welcome message to index.html. Now this is a pretty appropriate commit message for the change that we made to this file. Now this is by far one of my favorite features of GitHub Copilot, because I don't know about you, but if you've worked with GitHub before and GitHub repositories, I don't know about you, but thinking of commit messages for me is so mundane and it's such a horrible, horrible task. So having GitHub Copilot to do this for us is just an absolute game changer as far as I'm concerned. Now, of course, it's a very, very trivial thing to do to have to think of commit messages. But for me, this is an absolute game changer. It seems like something simple, but I absolutely love it. So this is by far one of my favorite features of GitHub Copilot.